Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary Podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Viddich, Graham Greene, Mick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 213 of the Spybrary Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to bring you a fascinating conversation with espionage intelligence historian Michael Smith. He's just written a book called The Real Special Relationship, the true story of how the British and US Secret Services work together. We cover a fair bit in this interview looking at how the special relationship started. How is it today? Even bringing in, believe it or not, Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart get a mention in this episode. Some of you will know them from The Rest is Politics. What I especially enjoy about this book is it's accessible. I am not a historian. I am not an academic. I'm just a regular guy who loves a spy read and also loves reading about spy history because, as I often say, spy fact can be stranger than spy fiction. And certainly in this book, and you'll hear a story at the end of the episode where Michael talks us through what happened when a Soviet jet crashed into West Berlin in the 60s. And those sneaky Brits were trying to, under the water, right? This thing crashed into a lake. And I'm not going to steal Michael's thunder here, but I just want you to hear that story. So let me share a little bit about the book. In The Real Special Relationship, Michael Smith reveals how it all began when a top secret visit by 4 American codebreakers to Bletchley Park in February 1941, 10 months before the US entered the Second World War, marked the start of a close collaboration between the two nations that endures to this day. Once the war was over and the Cold War began, both sides recognized that the way they'd worked together to decode German and Japanese ciphers could now be used to counter the Soviet threat. Despite occasional political conflict and public disputes between the two nations, such as during the Suez Crisis, behind-the-scenes intelligence sharing continued uninterrupted. Smith, having himself served in British military intelligence, brings together a fascinating range of characters from Winston Churchill and Ian Fleming through Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to Kim Philby and Edward Snowden, who've helped shape the security of our two nations. Supported by in-depth interviews and an excellent range of personal contacts, he takes the reader into the mysterious workings of MI6, the CIA, and all those who work to keep us safe. So, as I say, very accessible read. I learned a ton. I'm delighted to bring you this conversation with Michael Smith. And welcome to Spybrary, Michael Smith. It's episode 213. I was checking the archive. You were last on the show. It was episode 36, so BC, before COVID. It was 2018. So welcome back.
No, it's great to be back.
Yeah, I have to say, I read The Real Special Relationship. I was recovering from some surgery, and I'm going to kick this interview off by saying that you have a style of writing history that's very, very accessible. And I don't want to put any noses out of joint here, but there's a lot of spy espionage history that's quite dry, quite academic. It's still excellent stuff. But, it's a bit like planning for your long run when you're marathon training, when you pick up some of those books. Yours, though, The Real Special Relationship, I really enjoyed it. I tore through it. There was so much in this that I was not aware of. I enjoyed how you put in vignettes of stories about some of the characters involved, the locations. And what I often say, and I'm sure this wasn't your intention with writing the book, what I often say to budding spy writers is you need to read this stuff because you even write in here about some of these events would even stretch the credibility of a Hollywood director who would say, no way, that's too far-fetched. And you read the truth and think, wow, that actually happened. So big fan of the book. And I'd love to start off by asking you, what inspired you to delve into the history of the special relationship between the US and the UK?
I think one of the things that I found bemusing over the years is, as someone who worked with the Americans, in intelligence collection is how the media and politicians in general tend to say that there isn't a special relationship. And they've been doing that for decades. They've been doing that since Suez at least. And that's 1956. So, there isn't a special relationship on the surface that reflects the closeness of the special relationship that is behind everything our politicians do when they're making decisions on Ukraine, for example, at the moment, China, Russia generally, Iran. What makes them make the decisions they make? And the closeness of that relationship behind the scenes between NSA and GCHQ in particular, and they are so tightly interlocked, you can't pick them apart. Sharing the world between them, and NSA doing one thing and GCHQ doing another. It's frustrating when you see, every other week, something's happened, Biden's said something, or Trump had said something, or Obama had said something. That's it, the special relationship is over. And, it's really quite irritating to know that behind the scenes, all this stuff is happening. And if you are the president or the prime minister, and something comes in which is signals intelligence orientated, you won't know. And very often, even intelligence analysts might not know at the higher levels precisely which part of the GCHQ NSA operation picked that up. Because sources in intelligence are always kept very tight, and you don't want to lose them. And there are some sources, particularly in signals intelligence and certainly in human intelligence, any source in human intelligence, where if you let it go, that's it. It will never come back. And that's bedeviled the intelligence relationship between Britain and America since the very beginning with Enigma, obviously. And we can talk about that in a minute. But if you're the president and the prime minister, you're getting the same intelligence. And we both countries, obviously there are differences between the two countries, but both countries, broadly speaking, particularly now where democratic politics has moved somewhat to the left, and where there are differences of opinions between politicians, but generally speaking, we both look at the world in the same way. We're capitalist countries. We believe in the freedom of the individual. We oppose communist regimes and autocratic regimes. We believe very heavily in democracy. And if you have that same outlook on the world, then it's inevitable you are getting the same intelligence. It's inevitable that you will make similar decisions. And that's, in essence, that is the special relationship. That's what keeps Britain and America so tightly close together. Now, sometimes it can go bad. There will be a lot of people out there thinking the Iraq War, but sometimes it's really good. And most of the time it's really good, and most of the time it works. Now, there will always be decisions, and in recent years, very much so, the withdrawal from Afghanistan by Biden, which was an election pledge, ill-considered, in my view. And if you talk to any senior CIA officer or any senior MI6 officer, they will tell you privately that they absolutely agree with that. It was ill-considered. It was a ridiculous thing to do. So sometimes there will be differences, and sometimes politicians will not take any notice of the intelligence. But by and large, the intelligence comes in. It's extraordinarily good intelligence. Everyone talks about Five Eyes, and Australia in particular, particularly with China, is going to be a very, very important partner there. But the two prime partners, the two closest partners by far within Five Eyes, are Britain and America. And the intelligence they produce is so good that politicians getting it are privileged and able to make the best decisions. Well, they have the capacity to make the best decisions, but as you know, I say with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they don't always do that.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some of those later in our conversation. But I think, first of all, we need to send a copy of your book to Alistair Campbell, who runs this other podcast called The Rest is Politics. Because I was listening to a recent episode of his, and it was just after President Biden quickly popped in for a cup of tea with both the Prime Minister and the King. And he was like, oh, yeah, the press are playing up the special relationship again. That's just number 10 up to... And I'm sure there's some politics in it. But having read your book, I just finished it when I heard Alistair Campbell said that. I thought, someone needs to get this book into Alistair's hands. He's a big reader. He needs to understand a bit more about the special relationship, I think.
Okay, right. Let's do that. Let's do that. Yeah, that Biden cup of tea in Rishi was... and yes... Joe, that's how you pronounce it, was a typical example because the White House briefed out to the New York Times that actually Biden didn't see why he should bother doing it. Yes, the number 10 was briefing out to the media. It was an example, and actually both of them said in the press conference, it was an example of how tight the relationship is. So it's what you see on the front doesn't really reflect, the cover doesn't really reflect what's in the book.
So how did the close collaboration, how did the special relationship start?
It started back in February 1941. There had been a number of moves beforehand to try to get the Americans on side. And of course, America wasn't in the war at the time, and there was a lot of opposition to going to war in America. But gradually Roosevelt managed to wear that away. Very cleverly, the Fight Them on the Beaches speech by Churchill, which is one of his most renowned speeches, was actually created in order to help Roosevelt in his approach to getting the Americans into the war. It was carefully choreographed. In fact, it was broadcast across America, and of course, there's all the fighting on the beaches stuff. But the key thing was Churchill saying saying his hope that this would lead the new world with all its might and power to come to the aid of the old world. And that was the key phrase within there, just nudging away. And it, of course, it entered the minds of people right across the United States, and it really was the tipping point. So 4 intelligence guys from America, 2 U.S. Army codebreakers and 2 U.S. Navy codebreakers arrived in Britain at Sheerness in Kent on the 8th of February 1941, and it's 10 months before Pearl Harbor and U.S. comes into the war. And they met by John Tilghman, who was the leading British codebreaker, celebrated war hero, former army colonel, he was still an army colonel. And they were taken up And of course, there was a blackout. So, we're driven up to Bletchley Park. So that's something like 120 miles, I don't know precisely, around that sort of distance. And in the dark, with little slits in the blackout panels on their headlights of the cars. And they arrived at Bletchley Park, and they were taken into the office of Alistair Denison, the boss of Bletchley Park at the time. And Barbara Abernethy, his secretary, was called on to bring the sherry in, and she had this little barrel sherry, which he had to manhandle, or woman handle perhaps, and pouring out the glasses of sherry for these U.S. servicemen, all in uniform. And she said, she told me, she said, in an interview before she died, she said, I'd never seen an American before, apart from in the cinema. And the wonderful little vignette from that is that one of the first U.S. Navy codebreakers to go to Bletchley Park, not one of those four, but one of the first U.S. Navy codebreakers to go to Bletchley Park, and the guy who was in charge of U.S. Navy people at Bletchley Park, Joe Eakers, and her fell in love and married. So there's a special relationship on a very personal thing that came out of that. But of course, what we're talking about is the real special relationship, and that real special relationship was formed at Bletchley. One of the guys, I ought to say, who was the Americans, was a guy called Press Courier, and he was a US Navy officer. And he described, and I think this is what I've done throughout the book, is use interviews from people or people's accounts, sometimes from their memoirs, sometimes memories that they left in various interviews over the decades, to actually highlight. So you get a person who was there talking about what happened, not me, not me just saying it. It's someone who was there, and Press Courier was one of those who was there then, and that's when he met John Tilghman. And the key question for the British was, do we share the news that we've broken the German Enigma ciphers? And the Americans weren't in the war. If it was briefed out in America and got into the press, and from that time to this, in American intelligence sources are frequently cited in the US newspapers. If it was briefed out that the British had managed to break the Enigma ciphers, the Germans could have changed the machine just like that, and in doing it, prevent anyone getting back into it. And so it really didn't need much of a change. And Enigma, it's impossible to say what impact it had on the war, but breaking Enigma certainly shortened the war in some ways, certainly made operations successful that would not have been successful otherwise, or would have taken much, much longer to carry out. So it was hanging on a thread, and that trust that developed then between the British and the Americans. I ought to say the Americans had brought with them a special machine that would break the Japanese purple cipher, which was used by Japanese ambassadors abroad to talk to Tokyo, including, of course, the ambassador in Berlin, who was very close to Hitler and talked to Hitler all the time and got Hitler's words on what he wanted to do and what he wanted the Japanese to do. And that was a tremendous gift, which they gave freely. And at that point, John Tilghman goes to Stuart Mingus, the head of MI6, who was actually the top boss of GCH, of Bletchley Park at that time. he controlled the British code breakers, and said, look, they've given us this stuff. They're going to be going round Bletchley Park, and they will realise that they can't go into this hut. You can't go into hut 6 because we're breaking German Enigma in there. They can't go into hut 8 because we're breaking German Enigma in there.
Yeah.
They can't go into hut 4 because we're reporting on what we're doing with German Enigma. And Mingus went to Churchill and said, look, I think Tolman's right. And Churchill said, fine, but you've got to make sure you clamp down on the number of people that see it over there and not let them spread it around too much. And the Americans did that. And it's that sort of level of trust building up, and it built up during the war. And there were lots, and I document them. There were lots of ups and downs,
Yes.
falling outs and reconciliations and solutions found to problems that seemed intractable. But that developed trust, and it doesn't matter whether you're running an agent or working together as two teams, Americans and British, not necessarily trusting each other. Americans and Brits have had a history of sort of closeness, but also tension and dislike, mutual dislike. One of the code breakers described it as that initial relationship as two mongrels circling each other, trying to work out what the other wanted. And that's and that's what it was like. But the trust built up during the Second World War, then it carries on into the Cold War.
And what was the British influence on the genesis of the CIA?
The genesis of the of the Office for Strategic Services is the key element there. The British very much wanted, MI6 wanted, and naval intelligence wanted, and actually naval intelligence was representing in this air intelligence, Air Force intelligence, and military intelligence. They wanted an intelligence service from the Americans that would match MI6, that would do the same sort of thing. And OSS was set up. The British pushed very heavily for the British selected Bill Donovan because despite his Irish heritage, he was very realistic that America had to go into the war. He was one of the early people saying, look, we can't stand up on the sidelines here. This is what's happening in Europe is truly terrible. We have to get involved. But he was also very Anglophile. He was very Anglophile. So he was sort of selected by the British and nudged. It was nudged up that he was a good guy, and Roosevelt selected him to go to Britain to have a look and see, was it, tell him, was it worth supporting Britain? Now, obviously, Roosevelt's picked the man he knows will come back and say that, because Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's dad, was British ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Britain at the time, and he was obviously Irish heritage, very anti-British, and he was denouncing Britain. He was saying Britain would lose. There's no point in putting American lives on locking the line here to save the British. Just accept they're going to lose. Donovan went over there, and he was heavily courted by John Godfrey, who was Director of Naval Intelligence, and Stuart Mingus, head of MI6. He was introduced to Churchill. He went around Britain. He also went around the various locations where British troops were in the Mediterranean. He came back to America, and there was a great deal of opposition to the idea of another intelligence organization from the military, and also from J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. And he persuaded the president, and John Godfrey flew over to Washington to try to persuade the president himself that they needed an intelligence service, and subtly, without openly doing it, to nudge nudged the president in the direction of Donovan as the intelligence chief, although obviously Roosevelt was very keen on Donovan anyway, because they shared the same opinions. And Godfrey took with him his personal assistant, who was also the man liaising for naval intelligence with MI6 and Special Operations Executive. That man, of course, was Ian Fleming. And they stopped off in Lisbon on the way, because you couldn't just fly across the Atlantic. And Fleming heard that the Abwehr guys in Lisbon, because Lisbon, of course, was a neutral capital, the Abwehr guys in Lisbon loved to go to the casino in Estoril. And so Fleming thought, I'm going to go there. And he went there, play them at cards in the casino. He lost his £50 allowance, which was huge sum of money on that in that era. But it of course gave us the inspiration for Casino Royale.
Nice. Yes, I think this book is full
I think
of these
Spybrary fans will be interested in that particular little.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, he goes over there, and Godfrey has dinner with Roosevelt, and obviously pushes the whole idea, and he leaves Fleming behind. Fleming credits himself with having written the prospectus for the OSS, which eventually becomes CIA, obviously, through a few transitions. But that's not really the case. Obviously, Donovan did it, but with the voice from Fleming.
And I really appreciate in the book, you go into quite some detail on the special relationship, the birth of it during World War II. And there was a lot in there that I was not personally familiar with. And I want to be respectful of your time. We could probably spend about 3 hours just on that period of history. But I wanted to move us along. We've already mentioned a couple of presidents here and prime ministers. But when you look back at the special relationship, out of all the presidents and PMs, which ones would you say had the best relationship?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose most people would go to Tony Blair. I think Tony Blair certainly understood the importance of the special relationship on the outside. Whether what he did out with the intelligence relationship is an open question, of course. I guess the one I'd go to primarily is Harold Macmillan, because when he came in, he was replacing Anthony Eden. And Eden had, of course, been the architect of Suez. And Eisenhower had, as everyone knows, had stamped on the British. And that led to the failure of the Suez plan and a rather humiliating withdrawal by the British. And Macmillan came to power after that in immediate wake. And Macmillan had been British minister in North Africa, and had worked closely with Eisenhower when Eisenhower was out there for torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. They were close personal friends. They got on very well. And Eisenhower then, in the immediate aftermath of Suez, with the British media attacking the government because it destroyed the special relationship, bemoaning the fact that Britain was no longer a world power. Eisenhower went out of his way to rebuild that relationship, and particularly emphasizing on, because he'd been receiving the Enigma intelligence, he knew the value of the British intelligence system. He re-emphasized that. And there was a big meeting in Bermuda, between a summit in Bermuda between Eisenhower and Macmillan, and there was an open thing about, all the things they were going to do. And one of the things that they were going to do was allow Britain back into the nuclear secret, which we'd lost. Congress had voted in the wake of the betrayals from British scientists in the immediate aftermath of the war. Congress had voted to stop the British having access to any American nuclear technology. And Macmillan eased that back in, but Eisenhower said, no, we're going to start doing it again. But the key thing in the agreement, which wasn't actually published, but was briefed out to the New York Times, was that the relationship between British intelligence would remain at the high level that it had been during the war, and a full commitment to that. And so I think Eisenhower and Macmillan was a good relationship, and Eisenhower, more importantly, when his successor, John F. Kennedy, comes in, he briefs Kennedy on Macmillan. He briefs on how good a sounding board he's found Macmillan, and he briefs Kennedy on intelligence and how much of it comes from Britain. And that leads, of course, into the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, again, the British media were saying, the special relationship is over. Kennedy's going to blow the world apart. He doesn't care about us. He's not talking to Macmillan. In fact, he was talking to Macmillan every evening, using him as a sounding board, keeping me in touch with everything that was going on. And the British ambassador at the time was a close personal friend from school of Kennedy. So they were talking all the time. And actually, a little triumvirate in the White House was the British ambassador and JFK and Bobby Kennedy. And, they were the three key decision makers in the White House at the time.
Are you on the hunt for your next thrilling spy read? Look no further. Spybrary contributor and Sunday Times chief political commentator Tim Shipman has curated a list of his top 125 spy authors ranked. With Tim's vast experience and expertise in politics and spy thrillers, you can trust his judgment on the best spy authors of all time. This list includes both classic and modern writers, making it the ultimate guide for any spy fan. But wait, there's more. Tim also recommends which book to try first from each author, and he shares his favorite book from each of them too, so you can dive right into the best of the best. Ready to get your hands on Tim's list? Head over to spybrary.com/top125 to grab your free copy now. Don't miss out on the ultimate spy reading list. Visit spybrary.com/top125 today.
And that's what surprised me reading the book, because I don't, to my shame, know a huge amount about Macmillan. What I do know is he always seemed quite stuffy and formal, almost from a different era. So to read that he had this great relationship with the young JFK did surprise me somewhat. And do you think I'm right in saying, having read your book, that probably the worst, let's say, personal relationship was Nixon and Heath?
Yeah, I think Nixon and Heath, maybe Major and Clinton, both those relationships were very, very bad at times. I think Heath had a better understanding, in a way, of how he needed to keep the Americans on board. But paradoxically, with both of them, with Heath and Major, it was about Europe. And Heath was very much pushing all the time for a British membership of the European Economic Community, as it was then known as Common Market. And Macmillan and Harold Wilson, Heath's predecessor, had both tried and failed to join the EEC because of French veto. De Gaulle just opposed Britain being involved, partly because of his anti-Americanism. And the paradox there is because from the very start, the State Department had seen the close ties to Britain as a way to connect with Europe generally. We can be tight with Britain, but not too tight. We don't want to upset the French. We don't want to upset Germans. And that was the State Department's view. But Nixon and Kissinger were very much in favor of the special relationship. They were very, very firm on it. And reading Kissinger's memoirs, some of the things he says about the State Department and their anti-British approach was, which he describes as idiotic, were revelations really to me, because I'd not really realised quite how Kissinger was in favour. But on a couple of occasions, firstly, when the Americans wanted to get the British to do something with the French, and for them, openly for them, and he didn't want to do that because the French are anti-American, and he doesn't want a veto of his application to join the Common Market. And Kissinger said, right, we're going to punish him, and we're going to block British intelligence from any American intelligence. And it had a very minor effect, has to be said, because NSA said straight away, well, actually, our big problem is in the Middle East at the moment, and with had PLO terrorism, you had OPEC countries doing all sorts of things with oil, and of course the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanians all at each other's backs. And the main source for intelligence in the Middle East at that time, as it indeed is today, for American intelligence, was the British intelligence base on Cyprus. And the second time, it lasted 24 hours, during which time NSA and GCHQ completely continued doing exactly what they'd been doing 24 hours earlier, and had no real effect. The second time came when, during the Yom Kippur War in 1971, when the Americans wanted to send a spy plane, an SR-721 Blackbird, over the Egyptian and Syrian positions to actually provide intelligence on what was going on there, and wanted to take off from Akrotiri in Cyprus, which is where most US spy plane operations during the Cold War took place from. He said, well, yeah, you can't provide that intelligence to the Israelis. He subsequently claimed that he blocked them from using Akrotiri, but actually that wasn't what happened. It was so many hurdles were put in their place that the Americans said, no, it's all right. We'll fly from New York. We can do that. We'll refuel in Spain. Thanks very much, Britain. What shall we do? And there were all sorts of things they considered doing, from stopping getting the EU to stop subsidies to South Wales came up as a possibility. But again, Kissinger went back on the same thing, stop giving them intelligence for 24 hours, which in the middle of an Arab-Israeli war no one
Yeah.
actually going to do behind the scenes. So, you can imagine NSA directors nodding, yeah, sure, yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
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 I wanted to ask about two wars. Can you walk us through how the special relationship played out during the Vietnam War?
Yes, it's very interesting because obviously Wilson had insisted that that British troops would not be involved, and that led to a very strained relationship initially with Lyndon Johnson. And at one point, Lyndon Johnson takes, during a visit to Washington, Lyndon Johnson takes Wilson for a walk in the Rose Garden and suggests that maybe you could just send in this small group of soldiers just to fly the British flag, and that would reassure Americans that they weren't alone in this. I mean, even a few Scottish pipers would do. But Wilson held firm. He wasn't going to send British troops, but there was a lot of assistance given to the Americans when the Americans first went in. The U.S. Army had this idea of fighting war against the Viet Cong, pretty much as if they were fighting the Germans during the Second World War. And the British obviously had experience in Malaya of counter insurgency operations, which had been successful in Malaya, albeit it has to be said against a much weaker opposition than in Vietnam. So there was advice given. The CIA in particular took up on advice from the British, and the South Vietnamese president also took up on it. But the key thing is that the CIA took up on it, and they devised the Strategic Villages plan on the basis of what Britain had done in Malaya. And that, sadly, Kennedy was very impressed with all this. He was briefed on it by Thompson, the British guy involved. And his advisors were also very impressed by it, including Rostow, who was ex-OSS, so had worked in London during the Second World War. And that's a feature of the special relationship, is that you have guys who were there during the war working with the British, who then go through and become parts of various administrations, or are working in the NSA or the CIA, having worked with the British in London or somewhere during the Second World War. And so you have this relationships, and I spoke earlier about trust, and you have what are essentially relationships of trust between people who at first may well have disliked or distrusted each other, but like those two mongrels, but by now know from experience that listening to the Brits sometimes helps. And that the whole thing could have gone ahead. There was a plan that Kennedy ordered from Thompson, but it had to be sent by the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office held on to it because the British ambassador in Saigon opposed it, and it never got to Kennedy. And if it had, it might have helped. You never know. It might have done nothing.
Yeah.
Who knows? But but more to the point, once Rolling Thunder begins, this is the bombing operation of North Vietnam, and particularly once it starts moving closer to Hanoi, and the Americans, of course, don't have any representation in Hanoi. We did. We weren't at war with them. We didn't have an embassy, but we had a consul general, and we were on the. It was Britain and Soviet Union on the commission overlooking the separation between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So Britain had that sort of role there, and the consul generals eventually become MI6 officers. So there's MI6 officer, right through the rolling thunder, particularly the bombing of Hanoi. Every British consul general was an MI6 officer, and their main task was basically reporting on what was happening in Hanoi, what the North Vietnamese politicians were thinking. And Daphne Park actually was one of those. At the time, one of the most senior female officers, and she'd been in SOE during the war, and she'd actually trained Bill Colby in communications when he was in the OSS during the war. And so she had all these connections, and she says, and it's in the book, she says that whenever she had a problem with an American CIA officer, she would mention Colby's name. And she told Colby this.
Yeah.
And she said, oh yes, Bill Colby, lovely man. I trained him during the war, And then obviously she starts getting much more assistance. But she was in Vietnam, and she described herself as one of her main advantages, she said, was that she looked like a big fat missionary woman, and she used to have little drinks parties with Scotch whiskey. She had access to Scotch whiskey, so she's using that, and she chat away to Russian diplomats in her residence, these parties became really quite famous within that group of Russian, North Vietnamese, and she even had a North Vietnamese Politburo member come in, and she just sat there for 6 hours drinking whiskey with him. And the amount of intelligence you're going to get on what the regime thinks from 6 hours of drinking whiskey with a senior Politburo member is phenomenal. So, these people were doing a real job, and it's often said, the British did nothing in Vietnam, but actually behind the scenes, again, the front cover may say one thing, behind the scenes, all this is going on.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to highlight it in our conversation, because that was news to me. That was something I was learning. I wasn't aware of, the diplomats in Hanoi. And one of those was Rory Stewart's dad.
Yes.
I'm going to mention that podcast again. The rest is politics, but it was Rory Stewart's dad was on the ground there in Hanoi, wasn't he?
Yeah. So, we're sending it to them. That is, we're sending them a copy of the special relationship, relationship. Yeah.
You really should. You should get that across to them. So I learned a lot there. And then let's talk about the Falklands War. So we go from Vietnam, which was US-led, to the Falklands War, which was UK-led. What was the special relationship like then? What was happening between the US and UK when that was all kicking off?
Well, it was Latin America, of course, is extremely important for the US. It's not something that we are that particularly worried about normally. Obviously, we have got involved. We got involved with the Americans, helping them when there was a lot of problems with drugs coming out of Colombia. We obviously always have an interest in Argentina and the Falkland Islands. And the Americans, Gene Kirkpatrick in particular, the US ambassador to the UN, was very pro-Argentina. And a few days after, on the day of the invasion, she attended a dinner in her honor at the Argentine embassy, to the shock and horror of Colby, who was CIA director, and others, in the administration, and certainly to the anger of Mrs. Thatcher, you can imagine. 3 days after the invasion, there's a meeting in the White House of the National Security Council, in the White House Situation Room, in fact. And Gene Kirkpatrick is there, and Bobby Ray Inman is there. And Bobby Ray Inman was a former NSA director who was now, at this point, deputy director of the CIA. And Jean Kirkpatrick says, we got to stop the British. We can't let them get rid of the Argentinians. We got to tell Mrs. Thatcher she's got to back down. And there's discussion about this and a debate, and obviously people saying, well, no, the Brits are our allies, and others saying, well, no, Argentina's our ally too. They are a key bulwark against communism in Latin America. And the meeting comes to an end, and everyone, you know what it's like when you've got this big meeting of a number of people and they've all been sat there listening or whatever. There are people chatting away as they're walking out, anxious to get to the next meeting. And Bobby Rainman stands up and he says, we can't do this. It's ridiculous what Jean Kirkpatrick says. I'm sorry, I've got to say this. And he said, we have to stick with the British. Yeah, okay, I'm not just invoking all the blood ties, the fact we speak, our English heritage, number of people in this country who have English heritage, British heritage. I'm talking about what we do together in against communism in Europe and around the world. I'm talking about how tight we and the British are in intelligence terms. And it was very, very critical, one of the critical moments for Reagan, but also critical for Bobby Rainman, who a few days later, Jean Kirkpatrick was a formidable woman. A few days later, Bobby Rainman resigned, saying he's tired of bureaucratic arguments. So he's obviously been forced out, but he has laid down the line. And one of the key reasons he's laying down the line there is because he's been former NSA director and he knows how tightly they work with the British. And in fact, in 1980, a couple of years earlier, he had been at the retirement party of John Tillman. You remember John Tillman, who met the Americans in Sheerness when they arrived in 1941? And John Tillman is still working in 1980. And he had been sent across the Atlantic early on in the Cold War because William Weisband, who was an agent, a Soviet agent in place inside U.S. Army intelligence, had given away all the secrets of how the British and Americans in the immediate post-war period had broken most of the Soviet machine ciphers. And, arguably that was the biggest betrayal of the Cold War because it takes about 20 years before the British and Americans get back into the same similar levels to what they were then. And that's a huge gap in continuity in terms of intelligence because a human intelligence agent might produce something here or there, or some signals intelligence is producing intelligence every minute of every day. And so 20 years of lost continuity is an awful lot of a betrayal. But Tillman was sent across to America then to help the Americans get back into, and obviously British, but to work with the Americans to get back into the Soviet ciphers. He then is recalled to Britain in 1954 because he's 60. And in Britain, if you're a civil servant, you have to retire at 60. But GCHQ kept him on for another 10 years until he was 70. And then at 70, they said, well, you're going to go now. At that point, NSA say, no, you can't go. Come over here and work for us. Just work for us and work in our firefighting unit. The guys who are working there to break the codes that other people have been unable to break or to advise on how something might be done. And guess he's working with, alongside there, Press Courier, the U.S. Navy, one of the U.S. Navy guys who he met in 1941, and they are still friends, at that stage. And he retired in 1980. So Bobby Ray Inman knows how tight the relationship is. He understands the importance of working with people. He understands the importance of the trust that is engendered when you work with people for that length of time. And he is determined not to see that lost, even though this is his career as a result.
Before we wrap up, there was one story I'd love for you to share with our listeners. And this was forgive me, I'm not an aviation expert, but I believe it was called a Firebar, which was a Soviet fighter that crashed in West Berlin.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to do with this book really is to put across to people how intelligence works in terms of a piece of intelligence here, and then another piece of intelligence comes in from a completely different source. So you might have a human agent here, and the signals intelligence intercept hit there, and you can send over a reconnaissance aircraft to take photographs, and you can collect a piece of gossip from someone in Moscow that you're talking to. And it all feeds in together and produces this intelligence picture, which then you can build on by using other assets to add to. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is absolutely typical of this, and it really, the description of the intelligence behind the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it came in the book, I think is really a good demonstration of how intelligence really works behind the scene. And we're talking about earlier the influence it has on politicians, or how it works to help politicians make their decisions. And one of the things that did come in by coincidence, a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in 1966, we had a big base on Teufelsberg, which was a signals intelligence base. There's a photo of it in the book. And it was a man-made mountain made out of the rubble of Berlin after the war. And on top of it, this US-UK intercept site. And on this day in 1966, this Firebar went down. They were picking up the conversations, intercepting the conversations between the Firebar pilot and his base, and he lost power on his engines, and he couldn't keep the aircraft up. And he was desperately trying to avoid flats in East Germany, and he came down eventually in a lake, which is on the edge of what was East Berlin and West Berlin, and he came down on the British side. And immediately, the British mission to East Germany, what was called Bricksmiths, was there at the lake trying to recover the aircraft, because the Firebar had a skip spin radar, which was really the latest technology for Soviet fighter aircraft, and they needed to know what was in it. So technicians were sent over from Britain, flown over to Britain almost immediately, and they were going to recover the skip spin radar, and they did it surreptitiously. They sent divers down. They took the aircraft apart under the water, and while this is going on, there's a Russian delegation demanding to see what's going on, and so it's all being done very surreptitiously, a very secretive operation. They say intelligence isn't really like James Bond, but this, has elements of it, And underwater, they're taking the plane apart, they're taking the radar off, they attaching it to a long wire from a motor launch that doesn't seem to be doing much, just wandering around the lake, and just goes off to a jetty that the Russian delegation can't see because it's hidden by all the trees. And the radar is taken off and it's flown to the UK. And all the time the Russians are saying, "Oh, we're going to have this aircraft recovered." So they start to recover bits of the aircraft, and obviously they recover the bodies first because, sadly, obviously neither of the pilot or his crewman were alive. All this is being done in a very straightforward way, but as slowly as possible to give the guys back in the UK the chance, the scientists, to have a look at the various radar bits, and they then fly the radar bits, bar one tiny bit of it. They fly back the key bit, which is so complex they've got to keep it and look at it. They fly it all back to the UK. They put it back together under the water to Berlin. They put it back together under the water, and they then lift the aircraft out onto a barge, and they hand it over to the Russians. And the Russians come back and say, but there's a bit missing. Well, it must be in the mud at the bottom of the lake, the Brits say. And of course, the Russians can't say what it was that's missing, because if they did, they'd reveal part of their secrets. So it was a really fun operation, and that was carried out by Bricksmiths, which is a British mission in East Germany, and the Russians had a Soviet mission in West Germany, and the Americans had one in a U.S. mission in East Germany. But the Soviet mission in West Germany and British mission in East Germany, they were the largest ones, and they spent their whole time in this very hairy operations, going around tracking Soviet exercises and East German army exercises, and fighting and having to, being pushed out of the way by tanks, and having to do all sorts of things. And, there were deaths, but not many, thankfully. But these missions were collecting huge amounts of intelligence on what was going on.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of links to the show notes. Our friend Ian at Cold War Conversations has interviewed former Bricksmiths personnel. So if that's of interest to you, I will suggest you go to spybrary.com/213. But there's also a conversation that happens between the Soviet official or the soldier and the Brits. But I'm going to let you read that in the book because it will make you smile. Last question for you, Michael. What do you hope readers will take away from the real special relationship? Read the book. What do you want them to take away from it?
I want them to take away how intelligence works. So what I was talking about with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how a piece of intelligence here, and it starts in a very simple way, and how it all builds up into a jigsaw picture, and then how you move on from there, and how the politicians learn what's going on, and how they are then eventually, presented with a complete picture of what is, or as complete a picture as you possibly can, of what's going on. And I want to get across the tightness of the relationship, the intelligence relationship between NSA and GCHQ. I mean, if you go to GCHQ, there are Americans sat there working, and you won't know if they're Brits or Americans until they're in the mouse. And the same thing applies to NSA. And I want to give people an understanding of intelligence and how it works, because often what you see is, oh, this happened or that happened, or you don't actually get the overall picture. So I wanted to try and give the overall picture. So you don't just learn about Kim Philby and who he betrayed. You learn about the context in what and how much of it was important, and the rest, stuff happens. So that's the way it is. But I also wanted to make people understand that it is what's at the front, transient politicians saying things for political reasons, and we all know politicians do that all the time, taking positions again it's understandable that a US president will make decisions based on what's best for America, just as it's understandable that a British politician will do the same based on what's best for Britain. That sometimes leads to clashes. Sometimes politicians will say things for effect to actually drive something one way or drive it another way, or simply because they want to be popular with the people. That really is all irrelevant to the real special relationship. The real special relationship is behind the scenes, the tightness of the British and US intelligence services, how close they are, how much they share, and how much that intelligence is exactly the same if you're sat in the White House Situation Room or you're in the Cobra room in Downing Street. It's exactly the same intelligence driving the decisions towards being pretty much parallel. And that's why there's a special relationship between Britain and America. But the real one is the one behind the scenes.
Excellent. Well, I thank you for writing the book. I learned a great deal that I wasn't aware of before. And like I say, it's a accessible read, which again, I thank you for, because a lot of espionage history can be dry. Where can people follow you online, and where can they buy the book, Michael?
Right. Well, where can they buy the book? On Amazon. They can buy the book on Amazon. They can buy it in their local bookshop, order it from their local bookshop. And if their local bookshop doesn't have it, say, you must get this. What we didn't mention was, of course, that the foreword in the American book is written by Michael Hayden, who is the only man ever to have been director of both NSA and CIA. Subsequently CIA, not at the same time, obviously. And the introduction is written by Sir John Scala, who is the former chief of MI6, and says lots of nice things. Both of them say lots of nice things, but they're not the only ones. John Brennan, former CIA director, Mike Rogers, former NSA director, Leon Panetta, former defense secretary and former CIA director, all say wonderful things about this book, and they're at the front in the reviews in the US edition and in the UK paperback, and other British officials as well, other former directors of GCHQ saying the same thing. I think, I'm very proud of the book. I'm very proud of the reception it's had from former senior intelligence officials. But if that book has that sort of backing from so many former top US intelligence officers and bosses, it really should be out there in the bookshops. If it isn't, order it through the bookshops.
I did see it on my recent trip to London. I did see it in some bookshops there. And what I would say, I'm going to set a Spybrary challenge. So if you're a Spybrarian, you're in a bookshop, you see Michael's book, pick it up, just read that introduction by Mr. Scarlett. And if you don't then go and rush to the till with that book, something's wrong with you, because that was such an excellent text by Scarlett. What he wrote got me so excited about, that was the appetizer of what's to come, and then to go into the main course. Phenomenal. He did you proud there, Michael.
Well, I'm very grateful to him. Yeah. I'm at Mick W. Smith, and I'm Facebook. I'm Michael Smith. My Instagram, I think, is Spywriter Mick Smith, or it might be Spywriter Mick W. Smith. And I have a website, michaelsmithauthor.com, and I have page on, several pages on a British website called Aspects of History, which is really worth reading. Up there, not just me, I mean, there's other Ben McIntyre's up there, Max Hastings is up there, Giles Milton is up there, Damian Lewis is up there, one of my favorite writers. All of them people that Spybrarians would be interested in. So it's worth going up Aspects of History, and my page is obviously Michael Smith.
Excellent. I will add all of that because I know some of you might be in the gym, walking the dog, evading a tail. I don't know what you Spybrarians get up to when you listen to the show, but I'll add that to the show notes, which if you go to spybrary.com/213, all of Michael's details will be there. Michael, thank you for giving us an hour of your time. And I know you're busy, and we really appreciate coming on. In fact, there are a ton more questions we didn't get to. That's how much I love this book. So I urge you all to go out and buy it because it's phenomenal.
Thank you, Shane.
And thank you, dear listener, dear Spybrarian, for listening to the latest episode of the Spybrary podcast. I've had so many more questions that I really wanted to ask Michael. But the hour is up and I want to be respectful of his time and your time. What you can do, and what I urge you to do, is to join our community. We have over 3,000 fellow spy readers of both fiction, non-fiction in our community online every single day. Tons of posts about what people are reading, what people are watching, what we're learning. And Michael is a member of our Spybrary community. So if you have a burning question for him that we didn't get to, or something that came up in this conversation that you're like, Shane, why didn't you ask him more about such and such? Come in our community and ask Michael. I'm sure he'll be happy to respond to you. You can find that at spybrary.com/community. We've got some really exciting news coming up, of content coming up on Spybrary. I can't wait to share it with you. Bear with me. Next couple of weeks, we'll be making an announcement, and I just know you guys are going to love it. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully I'll see you in the Spybrary community. And until next time, do take care of yourselves.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.